because I've forgotten that in the past. Okay, today, and let me try and get my windows up. Today I'm going to break in a little bit. My plan anyway is to spend a bit of time showing you some um, clips from the internet that I find relevant to some of the underlying ideas of what we are talking about. And so we're going to see how that's going to affect our time. But if today I talk a few minutes over, I apologize in advance. It may well happen if I haven't found a break for talking about the Velikii Perelom and industrialization and collectivization, the Holodomor, and Stalin's falsification of truth, the dictator's insistence that his declarations constitute truth, were an important aspect of running the Soviet state. And so just kind of a heads up, that's where we're going today. Let me start sharing the screen. If you need to go, at 10 minutes to the hour, I take no offense. You can just tune back in and catch the last bit. We are indeed recording, so that hopefully a problem today. And all right. I want. Okay. I want to see you. All right. Well, all right. Be that as it may. One second. All right. Today we're talking about Stalin, or Stalin's rise. And here is, so we're talking about Stalinism today, and the episodes that we are going to spend the most attention to are The Great Break. And this is kind of a two-part program. It involves industrialization, it involves collectivization, and the industrialization, and basically it is an attempt to modernize the Soviet Union according to the precepts of the revolution. And it takes place on two fronts, the industrial front and the agricultural front. And we are also going to talk about the Holodomor, which is a famine in Ukraine, a state-induced famine in Ukraine. 1931 to 33 are the dates when it's most severe. And we're going to talk about Stalin's terror, the Great Purge. So, Stalin. Stalin was born December 18th, 1878, to a Georgian cobbler who had a drinking problem and was an abusive husband and father. His name was Yosef Vissarionovich Zhigashvili. A Georgian name. The Soviet Union is constituted of a number of different nationalities, and Georgian names. If you see a kind of Shvili, Shvili, you pretty much know that name is of a Georgian root. Georgian, not the state associated with peaches in the southeast of the United States, but Georgia, the state in the Caucasus. Actually, I should. Do I have a quick map to show you? Yeah, I do. This is skipping away a little bit from World War II. So this is skipping ahead to when we talk about World War II. But Georgia, so here is the Black Sea. Here's Crimea. Over here is the Caspian Sea. And there is a fantastic mountain range, which, among others, which contains Mount Elbrus, the tallest mountain in Europe, which I have climbed. And the Georgian nation is nestled in there. So that's where he comes from, this small mountain nation. Georgia's unique for a number of reasons, known for its really great wine, known for kind of a generosity of spirit amongst its people, and it is also one of the oldest sites of Christianity. When, in the wake of Jesus's death, as you had some prophets going out into the east, some moved eastward, and northward into the Caucasus Mountains, and in companies, in kingdoms that were called Mingreli, way back when, from the 4th century or so, you have churches. These churches developed very much in isolation from the kind of Roman Latin world, and to some extent, even the Orthodox world with its leadership emanating from Constantinople. And so it's kind of got a lot of particular Georgian Christianity, retained many particularities through the center. And so this is the kind of small mountain place that Stalin came from. Yosef Zhugashvili, and he had the opportunity. He was from a very poor family, but he did have the opportunity to go to seminary. His dad was a cobbler. He got to go to seminary. He wanted to be originally a poet, and it's said that he abandoned poetry because it required your total attention to do well, and that was just too much. When he was 7 years old, he had smallpox. His face was left scarred for the rest of his life. Also, as a child, he was involved in an accident with a horse cart, and the accident damaged his arm. And for his whole life, in public photos, it's somewhat stiff. He went to seminary to become a Georgian Orthodox priest. This was his intention, and he got involved in revolutionary movements. The appeal of the of kind of standing up against an oppressive state in which some lived so high on the hog, and so many others lived in economic vulnerability, if not poverty. Well, poverty really appealed for him. So he got involved in revolutionary movements, and he didn't go to his final exams, and so he didn't. So he was expelled in 1899. Didn't finish seminary. He joins the revolutionary movement and becomes a permanent revolutionary. You think about, here you are in college, maybe you're if you're in that 18 to 22 range, maybe your parents are asking, what are you going to do with yourself? And Stalin, he became a professional revolutionary, and he was put in charge, well, not put in charge, but he largely worked in the Caucasus. He spent his years agitating and fundraising. Fundraising in the Bolshevik revolutionary movement meant essentially bank robbing, kidnapping for people for ransom, being involved in extortion, counterfeiting money. At one point, when the party officially banned bank robberies, he temporarily resigned for a while. He came back. He married in 1906 to a woman who died not too long after of typhus. In 1912, he began Pravda from an existing party newspaper. Pravda would become the newspaper of the Soviet Union. Pravda means truth. And it's sort of a sad circumstance that by the 1970s, your average urban Soviet citizen understood that one couldn't read true things in the newspaper. This is something that I think it's really important to pay attention to. But he started Pravda. And again, one kind of theme that I want to come through is that Stalin is often remembered as kind of a dumb thug. But and Stephen Kotkin, as you may have heard in listening to some of the other lectures that I've shared with you, he he wants us to get away from this reputation. He thinks it's a little bit more the work of maybe the brilliant Trotsky, and in that kind of ideological battle, which Trotsky lost, and not just on the ideological front. He was ultimately murdered by Stalin. He was ousted and murdered. But that conjuring of an image of Stalin as the dumb thug isn't entirely isn't the most valid way of characterizing him. So he's involved with Pravda. It's around this time he starts using, Yosef Zhugashvili starts using the name Stalin. Stal means steel in Russia and in Russian, and so his intention is, unsurprisingly, to convey a sense of strength, of power. He's one of the few revolutionaries actually on the ground in 1917. As you recall, we're talking about all these people who are, living the decade preceding the revolution, more or less in Switzerland, planning for a revolution that they have no idea that's going to come. And he was one of the first official jobs he had in the Bolshevik regime. He was named the People's Commissar for Nationalities Affairs. Here's an issue we haven't talked about yet, but we will. The Russian Empire was not all Russian, and it is made up of lots of different nationalities that had been conquered, incorporated over the course of some centuries. There's a real awareness of that, and nationalism, national allegiance, patriotism is one of these notions that goes in the pot of bourgeois notions that when we get to kind of a final socialist, communist world, those national identities will fall away. And that there's just one large humanity, there will be world revolution. And so you can kind of hear, every time I hear anyway, someone say the word world government, for me, I see the shadow of the Cold War, where everything that the Soviet Union was bad, and everything that the Western capitalist world was good. And so a real kind of adherence to ideas of nationhood and patriotism, of course, nationalism, like some patriotism good, too much patriotism, it becomes nationalism, hyper-nationalism, and results in a justification for real mistreatment of other people that aren't of your tribe, shall I say. But yeah, when you hear this in the Soviet Union, if in theory there was this notion that at some point nationalities will disappear, there is this recognition that it's nowhere there yet. And to make a long story short, so what do you do about it? Well, since we're all Hegelians and history is going to evolve along one trend, one kind of developmental course, we are going to honor that, and we'll cultivate national identity until we can move beyond national identities. Anyway, we'll talk more about that. His first real official role in the Bolshevik regime is People's Commissar for Nationality Affairs. In 1922, in 1922, Lenin, who is the leader of the party, and I have, let's see, my picture is not so, boom, let me set a little bit better. Okay, so Lenin is the undisputed leader of the party, and he creates in early spring of 1922 the role of General Secretary of the Communist Party. He appoints Stalin to this role. So now Stalin is in charge of party membership across the Soviet Union. He quietly puts in charge people that he understands will be loyal to him. And sometimes in a meritocracy, you would choose the person that was, did the best at the job, was the most competent. One of Stalin's strategies was to find, if I can promote into this position, maybe not the person that's the best for the job, What an opportunity for them. Boy, are they going to be grateful to me. And this is one of the ways that Stalin very much cultivated loyalty in a quiet, lateral way. And having loyal personnel, people that feel obligated to you, the individual, as opposed to some idea, be it Marxist ideology, be it constitutional law. Having people loyal to you can be so important in affecting an agenda. And especially, it's essential if you are affecting an agenda that is against the ideology or against the law, for example. So this is how Stalin kind of finds himself in this position of power. And in May 1922, Lenin has his first stroke. And this is quite debilitating. He will die in January of 1924. But really, even from his first stroke, Lenin is compromised. And so there's an understanding that there's going to need to be a succession. Here, Lenin is in a wheelchair, and after one of his first strokes. And over here we see a picture. We see a picture. Here's Stalin. Here's Lenin. Here's Trotsky. Now, and here is a picture of Stalin at work in the Kremlin, and he burned the midnight oil. He put in an awful lot of hours. He went through a tremendous amount of documentation on a daily basis. We'll look at a little of that. Below, a portrait of Karl Marx, the ideological inspiration for the Soviet project. Now, there's been a lot of controversy, or one big theme in Russian history, in Soviet history, has been, how did Stalin win out over, Trotsky and Bukharin were no less capable, no less committed, and arguably smarter and more charismatic people. So how did Stalin win out? And we talk about kind of him creating a dividing and conquer, pitting these people against each other until he eventually rose to the top. And there's a degree of that, to be sure. He was a wily political actor, but he also, being in this role of general secretary, he ended up using it so effectively that, although this was never the intention, the most important role in the Soviet Union was general secretary. And so from Stalin, Lenin was never general secretary, but from Stalin onward, the leader of the Soviet Union was the general secretary of the Communist Party. And so think about it. It's almost like in America, we have an elected president, for example, but imagine if it's if it was, the head of the Republican National Party or the head of the Democratic National Party, who was actually the most important person, the most powerful person in the whole country. And that this person in charge of a party calls all the shots about government. Right? That's sort of the analogy. And one of the, again, jumping ahead to later in the course, but when people did postmortems on the Soviet Union, when did we know it was dysfunctional? When did we know it was going to end? Why did it end? One of the things that they've pointed to is how the party was more powerful, more important than the institutions of the state itself. We'll think more about that going down the road. Now, there's a testament that was supposedly written by Lenin. For a long time, this was kind of standard part of the historiography, but Stephen Kotkin is quite skeptical of this testament, that even if it was written by Kollontai, he's skeptical that Lenin was in a position to actually dictate it in these terms. But at any rate, this testament, supposedly from 1922, jotted down Lenin's thoughts on who should take control of the party. And of Bukharin, it said he's the favorite of the whole party, the most significant theoretician. Here's a picture. Here's Bukharin, Nikolai Bukharin, born 1888 and died in 1938 when he became a victim of the Purges. And so Bukharin, most significant theoretician, but weak on dialectics, right? That dialectical synthesis, antithesis. These are terms that these people think of as they, see themselves enacting an inevitable revolution. Zinoviev, but when clearly, if things are just left to themselves, that it's not going to go the direction they want it, probably. So, and then you had also Zinoviev and Kamenev. Here's Grigory Zinoviev. Here's Kamenev, really important people. And they earlier, so Stalin said they had wavered, which was not, of course, accidental, that they had early on been Mensheviks. These people committed more to a democratic interaction, maybe less radical moves than the Bolsheviks. And so that their earlier wavering, even though they're on board now, was, of course, not accidental. And then Trotsky, the Testament says of Trotsky, quote, certainly the most able man in the present Central Committee, given to excessive self-confidence and exaggerated concern with the administrative aspect of affairs. And then there was Stalin. And Stalin said, had concentrated boundless power in his hands. And Lenin worried, would he always know how to use this power with sufficient with sufficient caution? And in a PS in the memo, it said, Stalin is too rude to be general secretary, and that he recommended that Comrade Stalin be removed from his post. That, of course, did not happen. And that, of course, this captures contemporary sentiments of some elites in the party, like Trotsky, for example, and certainly probably Kollontai, to whom Stalin was quite rude on occasions. But Stephen Kotkin is skeptical that it was indeed Lenin's authentic work. I just want to tell one small story, actually, because this ties in a little bit. This right here is To Russia with Love, and it's the story of Vic Fischer. And Vic Fischer was born to a Russian woman and an American journalist who was kind of one generation descended from Ukrainian, moves to New York as a fishmonger. His son becomes a journalist. He's quite enamored of socialism and is a reporter there and falls in love with this woman who is a secretary in the Communist Party. They have a son, and it's we read Yelena Ginsburg's journey into the whirlwind, where she is taken into question, never sees her son again, spends time in the Gulag. Vic Fischer, his mom, has a different story, where the journalist dad, Louis Fischer, was something of a deadbeat dad, but he had met Eleanor Roosevelt before. And when the Purges started, he understood that his wife was going to be in tremendous danger. And he used that connection to get permission to have his wife and two sons transferred to the U.S., get to the U.S. Now, if not for that, here she is, a kind of educated woman who had intimate ties with a foreigner. She's a perfect candidate for the type of people that get shot or sent to the Gulag during the terror. But Louis Fischer's interaction is what saves them. And Vic Fischer, he just died last year at the age of, I think, 94. He was the oldest living member. He was a member of the Constitutional Convention for the state of Alaska. It's coming into statehood in mid-century. So it's a really remarkable life. But in this story, he tells the story of being a young child at the international school in Moscow when Bukharin's daughter comes to school after her father has been executed. And he writes of these are kids in the playground that don't understand what's happened. Her dad, loyal Bolshevik through it all, major leader, has now been executed as one of those enemies within, enemies of the people. And so you just see through the eyes of a child the how this jarring event is taken. Um, I take the time to mention Vic Fischer, because his dad, Louis Fischer, who's this journalist, quite enamored of the Soviet project, for example, but who is also the author of this book, Russia's Road from Peace to War. So he writes a book about kind of the Soviet Union's place in the world, foreign policy, very interested in that. He also wrote in 1926 this book, Oil Imperialism. So before, the first, although they've been digging oil out of the Caspian for centuries and like wrapping it around cloth and using it to light torches and stuff. Deep wells only start getting built in like the late 1890s. It happens in Pennsylvania, USA, happens around the Caspian. The Nobel family, who just awarded the who awards the Nobel Peace Prize, they make their money in oil in the Baku region. And so it's a new industry in the early 20th century, but Louis Fischer even writes a book about it called Oil Imperialism, seeing how this super concentrated, you can move it, so it releases so much energy, and this is before they knew there's any downside, is going to be such a game changer. And he was certainly right. When the United States invaded Iraq in 2003, one of that administration's justification was that access to oil is a key component of national security even. So just this product matters so much that we'll use the power of the state to militarily, violate sovereignty, et cetera, in order to ensure that this state still has access to it. So in those ways, kudos to Louis Fischer, but but real demerit to Louis Fischer in that during the Holodomor, which we're going to talk about momentarily, all of a sudden, when the Soviet Union is working hard to convince Western journalists, for example, that there's nothing to see here, everything's fine, building socialism, bounty is on the horizon. And you had some journalists like Walter Duranty who very much reported that line. And Louis Fischer instead lost his interest in the Soviet Union and headed over and got really interested in the Spanish Civil War. That was sort of his solution to that was his solution to dealing with perhaps the problem of this entity to which he is very ideologically sympathetic, is clearly engaging in actions that are resulting of death by starvation for millions of people. Okay, that's a little diatribe about, Vic Fischer's life and how it touches so many really big themes, both of the Soviet Union, of kind of US development in the Soviet Union, and the 20th century in general. Okay, so industrialization, what is this all about? Pretty much, if Bukharin was, he's a great theoretician. He's one of the people who is most on board for NEP. And he even, as they're making it up as they go along. And he says, well, we didn't think socialism would be like this, but here it is. And so we're in action. And he was one of the people that started to echo, sound notes along the line of, maybe this will be fine. Maybe this is how socialism goes along with some market activity and the state kind of managing, but not controlling everything. Stalin thought that this approach was an abrogation of Marxist ideology, that it was a betrayal of the revolution, that if you're really going to pull off this revolution, you need to have the guts to eliminate markets and to usher in this just world. There could be no tolerance for markets. And so Stalin made the choice in 1928 that they would usher in Velikii Perelom. Velikii Perelom is Russian for great break. Velikii is great, and Perelom, like perestroika, is like to build over, and Perelom is like to break. If someone lamal свою ногу, they broke their leg. And so there's, as I said, two-pronged, industrialization and collectivization. So Russia needs to modernize. Witte knew this, but we are going to really push it, and we're going to push it in quite heavy-handed ways. Stephen Kotkin's actually second book, his dissertation, turned into a book called Steeltown, USA, and then he essentially reworked many of the ideas in that Steeltown, USA into this book, Magnitogorsk. And let me see, oh, it's a little farther on the shelf. But Magnitogorsk is the story of a city that became the biggest steel producer in the Soviet Union. And again, the way you're going to have an ordered economy, the idea was, just as we talked about, isn't it so efficient if, every single family is cooking dinner and cleaning up after dinner every single night for everyone? Let's be more efficient about this. Well, same idea with the economy. Let's consolidate industries in one place and then another. If the idea of markets is that having lots of entities competing with each other to produce the best product, is, that's the basis, right? And then supply, and this thing called the invisible hand, the market, regulates supply and demand and leads to, the producers competing. So they're going to have lower prices and better quality so that people choose to buy them. Of course, to be sure, you might say, and the United States has really prided itself on being the capitalist market. And fair enough, you could say to me, but Professor Monahan, there's only like 4 major meat producers for the whole United States, and there's some evidence that they, cooperate regionally and on prices and stuff. Like, that's not capitalism. Or you might say, but Professor Monahan, we live in a, if markets, like if the consumer decides what to buy or not buy, knowing the price is essential in that. And, when I go, who goes to the doctor and is like, how much is this procedure? How much is that procedure? What are my options, right? And so, well, our healthcare system, which is what, 1/6 of the economy, doesn't seem to operate like a market. And you might even say, but okay, so now, Professor Monahan, but you've just got this regime right now in which the government has bought 15% of this company and taken a controlling stake of this company, and that is definitely not capitalism. So, how can you talk to me as if, the United States is this paragon of market operations in contrast to the Soviet Union? And fair enough, we'd have to talk longer about it because your criticism is entirely valid. But here I do want to just point to the power, perhaps, of the ideology, and the West, as the Cold War developed, especially had its ideologies too. At any rate, if part of the Soviet intention of having a command economy is that we're not going to have these efficiencies of no one needs to compete against each other, the state's going to control it. We can have one steel industry, and that steel industry is going to be in Magnitogorsk. So you have these gargantuan projects that they're pretty much building near some steel supplies in the Urals out of nothing. And Magnitogorsk is a magnificent book about both the nitty-gritty of trying to build a steel supply before you have people even living there. Stalin understood that it was quite likely that war was coming. And that was one of the reasons why developing the industrial capacity of the Soviet Union was so important. And so you have this intention, these plans to get the steel smelters and steel factories up and producing before you even have housing built. Like, so you have people living in tents in cold Siberian, icy, muddy winters going to work in these steel factories. And one of the and they even develop this industrial, this kind of hero of like Stakhanovite. If you've ever heard that word Stakhanovite, it's after like an individual, maybe this is mythical, or he's a real individual who supposedly was so strong and dedicated and loyal that on his shift, he would produce more than he would over fulfill the quota day after day, shift after shift. And it was sort of ultimately found out that one of the ways he's doing that is that, they would kind of change the work on the work floor so that people are like supporting him, so that he can kind of register these numbers and then advertise it as if, as if it was, just him, but as an inspiration and incentive for every Soviet citizen to work hard so that we could create this better society. And here is this is a little bit later, but this is another piece of propaganda where I just want you to see. Here we have, as you know by now, a bourgeois capitalist in a top hat, and he's got rings, and he's got in his hand war plans, because that West, they make money off of war. And this is and that's what they care about. You have dark clouds, and this is Russian for crisis. And it has so this is even, 1949. So this is later, and it shows, American production down 22% versus over here we have, a handsome, more fit, humble Soviet worker in the sunshine looking at Soviet stats, and their Soviet industry is up 20%. And so, and it says here, like, this very same years and such different weather, right? Like this was an important and constant part of state messaging. We are doing better than them. And make no mistake, in the 1930s, as the Depression ravages the United States, it was easier to really believe that indeed that might be the case. We can talk more about that. So that's kind of this push for industrialization. And then there is also this let's just go to one moment. So there's also this push for collectivization. What's collectivization? It means we're going to take the peasants and we are going to make them, let me kind of pull this down so you can see the, let me make that smaller so you can. We're going to take the peasants and we are going to not have all these different collective farms. Although I need to say, as you already know, a lot of agriculture operates in a sort of collective village type way where land is redistributed according to the elders of the village occasionally. And it's not straight up the private ownership that Stolypin was fighting for, right, against much resistance. But still, it isn't collectivization. And so collectivization is just like we're going to have big state industries consolidated in one place on this ordered command economy. We're going to have the same with farms. And all the peasants are going to work on this big state collective farm. Now, this move, we've talked about how, the SRs that the Bolsheviks wanted to kind of claim for themselves were definitely on the left. They had huge representation of the peasants, but they weren't really so on board with Bolshevik ideology. And so there is lots and lots of resistance to this move to collectivize. And the and so, I don't have it right in front of me, but maybe 2 years in, you could like 2 or 3% of peasants in the Soviet Union had voluntarily collectivized. So this isn't working. We need to get it done with a heavier hand. And they and in Ukraine, the results are catastrophic. Ukraine, the most productive soil in the whole Soviet Union, has become the breadbasket. So, let's see, need another map here. oh, this is about Ruth Bader Ginsburg's family history. But I want to point out, so here's Ukraine. Here is this is here this is because she had yeah, just passed away the last one of the times I was teaching this course, and I was curious about her family history and sort of made this slide. She was born, Ruth Bader Ginsburg was born as millions are starving in Ukraine. And so her family is coming from kind of two places in Poland. They're in this pale of settlement. Polish lands that we talked about, Jews, had been for a long time kind of pushed eastward. And this part became the pale of the settlement. There were no Jews, effectively no Jews in the Russian Empire until the partitions of Poland in the late 18th century. And then they came from this place. Her father had, or sorry, yeah, her father as a child, his parents, so her grandparents emigrated to the USA in 1909. So, kind of you think about this Jewish family making this choice, and they leave in 1909, and she is born in the United States. She, in 1933, one of, if 1932 was the worst year of the Holodomor, she comes after. But at any rate, so here we have this famine. Here's Odessa. And in the middle of the 19th century, in 1860 or so, the two biggest grain ports on planet Earth are Odessa and I think Chicago, Illinois, or Illinois into the Great Lakes. The kind of all that grain from the Great Plains and all that grain from Ukrainian lands of deep black soil. So tremendously abundant. And it's also, if soil gets exhausted over some amount of time, I kind of want to point out that this southern part, well into, I think even the 19th century, it's fair to say, is, well, no, late 18th century, still the domain of nomads. So you have this super fertile soil that for centuries, well after everyone knows that, growing food, agriculture, it's a big thing, and we want to find good soil. But nomadic groups so kind of rule the roost. And by that, I mean, you can have raids where they capture peasants and sell them into slavery. And so it, yeah, I mean, into the 18th century, even, you don't have this place being, so cultivated. And Catherine the Great, actually, one of her major programs is going to be to try and import Germans where there's kind of land hunger into the Russian Empire, more not here in Ukraine so much as over in the Volga lands. Where she they recruit, send pamphlets and people, come live in Russia, have your own farms. And it's somewhat successful. And that's when, we start to see more agriculture coming south, south, south. So super fertile lands that has a horrific famine, 1931, 32, 33. Holodomor, death by starvation is what it means in Russia, in Ukrainian. So what happens? And I just wanted to come back right here. Here, we'll look at a little more, bit more propaganda. So Stalin releases his 5-year plan. This is in the Soviet economy, command economy. It's going to operate in 5-year plans that we produce a plan of how the whole economy is going to work. I mean, this is too big a task, right? But if you take on the task, then you're responsible if it doesn't work. But they're going to have a 5-year plan. And so enemies, so here it says, Vragi pятилетники, enemies of the 5-year plan. And they are, drunkards and kulaks and bourgeoisie and priests, and also Jews as well. These are all the groups that are, not that there's more, Nep men were the last of the bourgeoisie. And so these are the bad people that are keeping us from our success. And here we have the shock harvest. I harvest for the Bolsheviks. We have kind of a healthy, pretty, you know, idealization of a peasant woman who's working in the field to harvest for the Bolsheviks. And so there's this constant messaging about who's good and who's bad. So nonetheless, despite all this messaging, there is a lot of resistance. People are like, we are not on board with this. In 1930, Stalin even gives this dizzy with success speech. March 2nd, 1930, he gives this speech where he says, "It is a fact that by February 20th of this year, 50% of the peasant farms throughout the USSR had been collectivized." Parenthetically, that is an outright lie. The leader of the state saying blatantly untrue things. And that means by February 20th, 1930, we had overfulfilled the 5-year plan of collectivization by more than 100%. Some of our comrades have been dizzy with success and for the moment have lost clearness of mind and sobriety of vision. End quote. What does that mean? This is a moment where Stalin is saying, oh, we've lost sobriety. We need to backpedal a little bit. Now, Stalin, like the regime leader, is not going to say, I made a mistake. So instead, he says, some people have gotten a little bit carried away, but this is a signal that we're going to backpedal a little bit on forcing people to, either overproduce in their factories, go where they're sent, get on the collective farm, and which means, giving up, the place you lived for generations. So there's a little bit of a backpedal, but not for long. There's so much resistance. On August 2nd, 1932, there's a decree about the protection of socialist property. And it becomes legal to steal any grain. And the price you'll pay is death or a 10-year sentence in the Gulag. December 27, 1932, they introduce internal passports to peasants. In this socialist society, which is going to be freer and better, peasants may not move from one town to another. And your passports are they are to the town. They're not to the Soviet Union. This is not for international travel. This is an internal passport where you don't have permission to be outside the town you're assigned without special permission. These passports, and the internal passports get introduced. Rural peasants are not even issued passports at all. They're not allowed to officially move. And that stays in effect until 1974. And this is kind of a measure the state is taking into, like, things are really not going well. A little bit farther to the east in the Kazakh steppe, you have denomadization and a typhus epidemic. It is estimated that 40% of Kazakhs may have died, of people in Kazakhstan, many who still live nomadically. 40% might have died in 1931 to 1933. Sarah Cameron has a terrific book, The Hungry Steppe, that details that history. And in that famine, it's estimated maybe 1 to 3 million people died, and they lose so much livestock, and they depend on livestock for life. So you have more starvation. And by 1933, it's estimated that the Soviet Union, there was less than half of the livestock that had been in the country in 1929. I mean, one of the things people are doing is if they don't have grain, because there's been grain requisitions, and that's what's happening, is the state is requisitioning grain. Here's a picture of that. If they don't have grain, they are killing their cattle. Everything's being taken from them. We might as well eat it this year, but what are you going to do next year? Pastoral people for society, years and years, if you're a pastoralist, you learn how to live in rough time, lean times when your cattle isn't giving milk. For example, one of the things pastoralists had developed over centuries, certainly throughout Central Asia, is you slit the animal's throat, you take a little blood. Blood has calories, it has nutrients. You make kind of a bouillon type of soup, and you sustain this until, it's time to eat an animal, until your animal is giving milk again. But in the wake of what's happening now, you just have people like, if they're just going to take it, we're just going to eat it right now. in addition to disease spreading through cattle. So the Holodomor. We move from kind of Kazakhstan to Ukraine, and so if you need to go, I'm going to keep talking and catch the last end of this, and I'll stop with the Holodomor. 1932 to 1934. It's thought that between 5.5 and 8.5 million people die. These numbers have been so controversial. The most sober accounts really put it at around 5 million people. 1932 was a bumper crop in Ukraine. And it's been called by the UN a genocide, that the intention is to eliminate kulaks and Ukrainian nationalists. Remember, this is a problem, and a problem that Stalin is aware of. Ukrainians have created a Rada, declared self-determination, great, we'll be our own republic, fought a civil war, and still you have lots of Ukrainian nationalists. And so requisitioning the grain hardcore against these people can be one way of eliminating political enemies, Ukrainian nationalists. And so that use of that word genocide is very controversial, as we know from watching what's been happening in Gaza. And it was the UN has determined that we can call the Holodomor genocide because it was targeted to eliminate kulaks, who the Soviet Union determined to be class enemies, and Ukrainian nationalists. This was all kept secret until Perestroika. Like, people in the Soviet Union did not know about this until glasnost of the 80s. And so people had built, they would build secret compartments to hide their grain, and then you'd have Bolshevik leaders coming and requisitioning it from them. They put children to work in watchtowers, taking, to watch if anyone is out in the field, stealing some shards of grain. We have these kind of records of grain production, and we don't have full records for every year, but certainly, 1932, it's a good year. Subsequently, we don't even have production here at the very end of the war. Things are destroyed, not surprising. This is kind of during World War II, and then things went up, 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 up. But that's sort of kind of line, and the dotted lines are, estimated. But those data points say something quite telling. One of the most horrific aspects of the Holodomor, we'll get to in a minute, but I just want to recap a little bit that in 1891-92, there was famine in which the Zemstvas kind of showed themselves like reactive and trying to help things. This was a tremendous crisis, and many people used it to kind of point to how horrible the Tsarist regime was. About 500,000 people were estimated to have died in that famine of 1891 to 92. In the famine that we talked about on the Volga, it's estimated that 5 million people died. Really, really huge as well. And then in the Holodomor, one of the things that's just so horrific about it was that it was self-induced. And I'm gonna show some really disturbing pictures here. Just be warned, because this is what happened. The details are beyond horrifying. One journalist, the sole journalist who reported on this atrocity, I told you, Walter Duranty, celebrated American journalist, he reported the Kremlin line while they wined and dined him in Moscow. Louis Fischer, another celebrated journalist, he's like, I'm more interested in the Spanish Civil War. I don't want to, I'm going to lose interest in this for now. And the sole journalist who reported on this atrocity using his own name, and Tim Snyder writes about this in the book Bloodlands. He wrote something according to something like, future generations will have a hard time believing it even happened because it's so horrible. Cannibalism was widespread. Families ate each other. Children were eaten. Parents might lock up their kids in some hiding place in the house so that they wouldn't be taken away by marauding people that were so desperately hungry and looking for something to eat. In the years 1932, 1933, 2,505 people in the Soviet Union were arrested for cannibalism. This is an undercount of the circumstances. The journalist wrote that an infant suckling its dead mother was a common scene, so common that Ukrainians developed a special phrase for it, the bugs of Soviet spring. And this is no place for humor, but like in the Monty Python movies where they have these bring out your dead scenes, but I'm not dead yet. Ah, you will be soon. It's not funny at all because it really happened. Body collection crews would collect the weak along with the dead in certain cases because they understood that they would be dead anyway. One man went to a cemetery, dug his own grave with his final strength, and laid down in it to wait for death. Children starved regularly. I actually met a woman who kind of told stories of her family trying, like a child in the family, just trying to walk westward and managed, and ended up through a very convoluted story, getting to America and having a life. The Soviet Union produced propaganda, produced posters saying it is a crime to eat people. And I once upon a time, I have those. And so, what does it say that a state finds the need to produce public messaging saying it's a crime to eat other people? So, how many people died? In a private meeting of 1933, Soviet officials themselves quoted a number of 5.5 million already. And here I'm going to show you just some really sad, horrible issues. Here is the United K Daily identified this photo as people selling human body parts for food. And this is actually a picture from the 1921 famine. So, this is something that happens in times of famine. These are children that are dying of famine. This is a picture from the Holodomor of, people walking by, corpses or people on their last limb during this horrific period. You can learn more about, there's lots and lots of information about the Holodomor on the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute website. They have a tremendous amount of resources, and this is from that website, and it's a map of the depopulation of Ukraine and southern Russia from 1929 to 1933. And the territories that ended up being part of Ukraine, but are not part of Ukraine at this time, the Soviet Union will only acquire them in World War II, are shown in white. But you have some regions here is kind of Donbass, where a quarter of the people are die. And so what happens? Well, a lot of Russians get resettled to these areas. And so this is kind of part of the reason why you had, a kind of part, not the only one, and we'll talk more about this, but part of a real separatist movement, because so many people, the Ukrainians, starved to death during the Holodomor, and the area was resettled with Soviet citizens that, got land and have a loyalty to the regime that it in some ways has contributed to what we've seen with the manufactured and facilitated and efforts of Putin to, claim that they are just helping people. We'll talk more about that. Here is another webpage from the Great Famine Project. For the sake of time, I'll skip over this, but I just want to point out that the results, I want to point out one. In 1936, the Soviet Union released its, published its constitution, and it claimed that the people of the Soviet Union were the freest people in the world. This was the freest constitution in the world that protected civil rights more than any other. And and if you were to read the words, that is indeed the case. This is a poster getting ready for the census. We're going to have a census in 1937. When the results came in, they were so devastating that the results were quashed. The 1937 census was quashed. All right, we'll end there, and Wednesday we'll talk about the Great Terror. Have a good rest of the day.